Good afternoon. I'm Kate Rosenblatt, and I'm thrilled to be moderating this panel, distinguished panel, on adding Jewish to feminist. So I'm going to give you a couple of short bios, but of course the more extended biographies are in the program. I have a couple of questions that I posed to the panel, and I'm hoping after those questions we'll open this up to a conversation and hear from you all as well. Yeah, that's our plan. So I'm happy to be able to introduce Martha Ackelsberg, who is the William R. Kennan Jr. Professor Emerita of Government and Professor Emerita of the Study of Women and Gender at Smith College. She's published on a wide range, including women's activism in Spain, the United States, and Latin America, on gender and public policy, on feminist and democratic theory, and on changing understandings of families, gender, and citizenship, and of course Jewish feminism. Rabbi Maralee, yes, I'm saying that right? Maralee Gordon is a recently retired pulpit rabbi, president of the Greater Carolinas Association of Rabbis, and an active participant in the Interfaith Committee for Detained Immigrants. In the early 1970s, she was the founder of the Jewish Feminist organization, edited the Jewish feminist newsletter Lilith's Rib, and taught at the Liberation School of the Chicago Women's Liberation Union. She was also a founding member of the Chutzpah Collective, a radical Jewish political collective in Chicago in the 1970s and early 80s. Clare Kinberg is currently the librarian at Temple Beth Emet, the director of the Ann Arbor Reconstructionist Religious School, and the editor of the Washtenaw Jewish News. We're in Washtenaw County. And she was also managing and general editor of Bridges, a Jewish feminist journal from 1990 to 2011. And last but not least, Judith Plaskow is Professor Emerita of Religious Studies at Manhattan College, and a Jewish feminist theologian. She is the co-founder and was for a long time the co-editor of the Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion. She is the author and editor of several works in feminist theology. You've all probably read Standing Again at Sinai, and other works. So I'm really thrilled to be able to start our conversation. And the questions that I posed to the panelists were, first, for them to reflect on if there was a sort of moment, a kind of light bulb moment, a turning point, when everything changed for them. And what was that for them, and where did it come from, and how did it hit them? And the second was, what was the nature of the work that they were engaged in as Jewish feminists or feminist Jews? And does, in fact, the frame of adding Jewish to feminist capture their experience in feminist and Jewish spaces? So I think we'll go ahead and start with Martha.
Okay, thanks very much. It's great to be here and to meet old friends and meet new people and put faces to names, and it's been kind of an amazing process. So for me, there was, I would say, not one individual moment, but rather a series of things that made clear over time to me in various different contexts that something was wrong and that I needed to do something about it. And I think overall, if I had to make some general statements about that, it was that particularly in the Jewish, since we're talking about Jewish feminists, being in spaces that were supposedly egalitarian and realizing that they weren't. That is the overall frame for what I would call light bulb moments. And so I'll just give you brief flavors of a number of these. I was vaguely aware of unease, let's say, even when I was in junior high school. Within the Jewish context, I was bat mitzvah on a Friday night. Boys were bar mitzvah on Shabbat morning. I had been a leader of the junior congregation, but once I hit puberty, boys were the leaders, girls were not. I was allowed to sit in when one of my the other good student in the class was learning from the Chazan learning the Nusach for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And he got to practice, I got to listen, and then he got sick right before Yom Kippur. And I ended up leading the service, but not having practiced and not having gotten any feedback. But since there was nobody else, they let me do it. When I got to college, I want to give him a shout out, Rabbi Ben-Zion Gold at Harvard, Harvard Hillel, tried to get Paula Hyman and me to lead services at the Worship and Study, which is to say the non-Orthodox minyan, which we both had the capacities and the skills to do. Both of us were very hesitant to do that because we had accepted the general view that if women got involved, the men would leave. However, he convinced us, and we did, and the world didn't end. As a newly married person, I was married at the time, I moved to New York, got involved in a consciousness-raising group of wives of medical students, among which was also Paula. And during one of our evenings, we realized we spent a lot of our time talking about sitting at home waiting for our husbands, and that it was time to do something instead. We formed the Women's Health Collective in New York and did a New York version, basically, of Our Bodies, Ourselves, although we didn't know that that was happening in Boston. We gave classes in storefronts, and we also started the Women's Health and Abortion Project. As a member of the New York Chavurah, which was a presumably egalitarian Jewish countercultural community, I was present along with one other woman on a Shabbat morning when one of the men described one of what was his favorite prayers and mine, Nishmat, as this tremendously wonderful experience. And then he said, at the moment of ejaculation, and somehow or another, we both wandered out of the room at that point, realized that what we thought was our community was not. And out of that, we started a study group on women in Judaism that then became Ezrat Nashim, the first, so far as we know, second wave Jewish feminist group that then went to the Rabbinical Assembly and started a whole stream of trying to change the non-Orthodox world. And one other similar kind of moment at the National Chavurah Institute in 1980, I think it was. Again, a supposedly egalitarian countercultural community. I was in a Torah study class. I love Torah, and there was a discussion of the Parsha when Abraham basically pimps Sarah to save his life when he goes so Pharaoh won't kill him. And this was not under discussion, and I said to the person, can we talk about the fact that Abraham was basically pimping Sarah? And he said, well, that's not what we're talking about now. So I left that class, went to another class that actually Judith was teaching, and out of that experience, a whole bunch of us said, this is amazing to have a whole bunch of classes on women in Judaism. What if we set up a situation for ourselves where we just did that and had only women come? And out of that came B'nodesh, the Jewish Feminist Spirituality Collective that's now been meeting for 37 years. So I'll stop at that for the moment and talk about the next thing later.
Hi, everybody. I'm Clare Kinberg, and take off my glasses so I can read. I think I'm the first speaker today who's like from a slightly younger generation, so that everybody else was like the things that I read when I was young, and I want to. The chutzpah anthology saved my life. Anyway, in the late 1970s, well, like really 1976, 77, I lived with other lesbians on a 140-acre farm in southern Missouri. We had a cow, several goats, hay fields, a large garden. We heated with wood. We had an outhouse for, and we took care of each other as best we could. I was 22. Lesbians came to the land to experience the possibilities of life off of the patriarchal grid. It was during my months there in the Ozarks that I first read Mary Daly's Beyond God the Father, toward a philosophy of women's liberation. And to begin the book, Daly chose a quote from Robin Morgan as an epigraph. And I sort of want you to imagine me living in the Ozarks on a 140-acre farm with just a lot of other lesbians. This is what those 5 lines say. I want a women's revolution like a lover. I lust for it. I want so much the freedom, this end to struggle and fear and lies we all exhale, that I could die just with the passionate uttering of that desire. Daly's book attempted to expose the root of patriarchy in the religions of the Old and New Testaments, or the Torah and Christianity, in the conception of God in Torah and all the ways that the male conception of God were transformed. And the conception of God shaped women's and men's lives, and she began the imaging life if the conception of God were transformed. I'm sure most of us here are familiar with this work. If not, you should be. And the truths of Beyond God the Father rearranged me, given where I was living, on a cellular level, I would say. And I still, to this day, cannot read a page of, or a verse even, of Torah without managing my rage at the sexism and hierarchy in the ways that those words perpetuate a world from which I want all of us to break free. And yet, from that day to this day, I've worked at Jewish supplementary schools, teaching kids, among many other things, those Torah stories. As I I edited this morning, so some of it doesn't quite make sense. But I'm going to tell 2 more stories. When I came back to St. Louis from the farm, in the early 1980s, I was teaching 7th grade Sunday school at a Reform congregation. And today, I find myself the director of a Reconstructionist religious school in which the curriculum which I designed teaches those same stories to the youngest students. And how I got to this place, a place of constant struggle, might be explained in the next couple stories. But let me take this opportunity to thank the intransitive verve of a God that hundreds, perhaps thousands of feminists have reworked, retold, reimagined these stories so that I can convey them to my young students. This is a story the second story that I want to tell briefly is one that I've told many times, and people here who know me may know this or not, but in 1981, I had not been back from the farm for that long, but I was working as a sewer in a coat factory. And I was on a bus with my union going to Washington, D.C. for the jobs, justice, and march against Reaganism, basically. We were on the bus overnight. I was the only white person on the bus, and we were playing cards through the night. And someone asked me what I was, and I really did not want to say that I was Jewish. So I kind of evaded it for a minute, saying that I was Russian, I was Romanian. Everybody looked at me, and I finally said I'm Jewish, and then I got up and left. And I sat at the front of the bus thinking, like, why was that so hard? And a young African-American man came up and sat next to me, and he said, why didn't you just want to tell them that you're Jewish? And I said, I don't know. It was like he's speaking to me like my conscience, And he said, well, look, if you would be more open about you being Jewish, it makes it easier for me to be Black. And, that was like a changing point for me in terms of being Jewish in the world and crossing over my different lives. One more little story, which is a couple years later, in 1983 or 84, I went back to school, which I'd never gone to college, but I decided I wanted to be a teacher. So I went to a historically Black teachers college in St. Louis. And Jesse Jackson was running for president. And I was very enthusiastic about the idea of the Rainbow Coalition. Jesse Jackson was talking about women and people of color and Jews and gays coming together and forming a coalition that would have enough strength to make change. And this was really appealing to me. And I was at a street rally where he was speaking at a rally that was like, a block party kind of thing. And I looked around and there was a few other Jews there. But I realized that the coalition that he was talking about was not a coalition of individuals with different identities, but a coalition of groups of people. And that my work was in the Jewish community. I wanted to organize in the Jewish community so that I could say that the Jews were part of the Rainbow Coalition. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
Hello, everybody. I also would say that I didn't have a light bulb moment that, in a sense, I went through a light bulb semester, I might say. I became a feminist in the course of the fall and winter of 69, 70, when I was a grad student at Yale. And that was the year that Yale admitted women to the undergraduate college. That was a huge deal nationally. It was on the front page of the Times. Yale was very busy preparing for the education of women by putting full-length mirrors in the bathrooms and hiring a gynecologist for the health center. And 3 graduate students called the meeting to discuss how it was that we'd been at Yale for 80 years and no one had noticed. We'd never had a gynecologist in the health center. I went to the meeting really out of curiosity. I absolutely would not have defined myself as a feminist at that point. But we began meeting weekly for consciousness raising and activism, and I was more and more deeply drawn in the course of the semester. There were many moments at which I realized, with a combination of anger and gratitude and awe, that what I thought were my personal problems were in fact rooted in women's socialization. The Yale Women's Alliance was a very narrowly defined group. We were all white. I think that at that point you could have counted on the fingers of one hand the number of students of color in the whole graduate school. And we were all doctoral students at Yale. But the fact that we had so much in common also highlighted the messages that we'd all been given about being girls who were too smart, and really made the cultural narrative that we were part of very clear. And then in February of 1970, I attended a conference that had been organized by the women of the Yale Women's Alliance and a feminist group in the law school. It was a conference on feminism. And one of the speakers was Naomi Weisstein. And she described in graphic detail what it had been like to be a female graduate student at Harvard. The posturing, the pipe smoking, the condescension, the surveillance of women, the completely different standards we were held to. Every single word she said described my experience at Yale. And then she said two things that changed my life. She said, I still can't say this without crying, that women want to be doctors and lawyers and ministers and end up doctors' wives and lawyers' wives and ministers' wives. And I was a young woman who had wanted to be a rabbi and who was a rabbi's wife. And then she said, we can change all this, but we can't do it alone. That was her refrain. She must have said half a dozen times. And I went home and I cried all night that I had wasted my life. I was 22. And I was signed on. But meanwhile, the previous June, I had married a graduate of the Jewish Theological Seminary. So ironically, at exactly the moment when I was becoming a feminist, I was also exploring a much more traditional Judaism than the Reform Judaism that I had grown up with. And in fact, I was spending Shabbos morning sitting at the back of the Yale chapel, not being counted in a minyan of male undergraduates. So that my feminism and my Jewish life were really on a kind of collision course. And one morning, my then husband and I were standing outside the chapel chatting with a friend, and one of the undergraduates came out and asked him to please come in because they needed a minyan. And it hit me like a ton of bricks that I could have stood out there all day because my presence was completely irrelevant to the purpose for which we were gathered. And I did go in that morning, but very shortly thereafter, I decided that I would never again walk into a service where I was not counted. And I've stuck to that for the last 50 years. So that was that was sort of my first feminist act. And at the first Jewish Women's Conference, I talked about the Jewish feminist conflict and identities. That was the title of my talk. But I think it's really important to say that I was at a Jewish feminist conference talking about the conflict and identities, that both sides of that identity were total givens to me. And, you know, on one level, they were separate categories, but on another, they weren't, because they were both totally part of who I was.
I'm actually going to speak to both questions. I'm the bridge here. I hope you take that, I'm not taking your place. The bridge. Anyway, because the aha moment for me was not in terms of feminism, but in terms of taking feminism outside of the bubble. And I'll explain. I grew up in a family that spent a lot of time in the synagogue across the street from our home. It was a Reform synagogue, where we had Sunday school on Sunday morning, and then there was Hebrew school during the week. And I asked my parents if I could go to Hebrew school. And I learned later they weren't planning to send me. They were going to send my brothers, who were younger than I was. But I had the example of two older cousins who had become bat mitzvah. And so I did become bat mitzvah. 3 girls became bat mitzvah that year. 30 boys became bar mitzvah that year. That was 1961. In high school, I started going to Reform Jewish camp in Wisconsin, now known as USRUI by its initials, in Economowoc. And I discovered Jewish community. And I realized how much more vibrant it was and how much more communal it was than the synagogue experience where I was growing up. And so I decided that I was going to go into Jewish education. I graduated from high school in 1966. There were no female rabbis, but I was going to go into Jewish education. So I went to Brandeis. I majored in Near Eastern and Judaic studies. And along the way, 1968-ish, we started the Jewish Activist League. And one of the things we did was we went and spoke at synagogues about anti-war activities. And another thing that we did is we started the planning for a protest at the annual meeting of the Jewish Federations that was meeting in Boston that year to protest the fact that they were spending so much money on kosher meals for hospitals that largely weren't Jewish anymore, and were not spending money on Jewish students and on Soviet Jewry. Well, by the time I graduated from Brandeis in 1970, I had become kind of disillusioned with the Jewish community. I came home to Chicago and jumped into the countercultural community. I worked on the countercultural paper, the Chicago Seed. We had an editorial collective. We reported on feminism, racism, anti-war, the whole gamut, gay and lesbian activities. And about a year later, I moved into a commune that had been started by radical Mennonites. You might not have ever heard those two terms together, but they'd gone to school together in Bethel, Kansas, and they were doing anti-war work and whatever. But by the time I joined the commune, many of them had moved to farms in Wisconsin, and it was opened up, and there was a former Jesuit priest and all different people, and I moved in. That was 1971. And as soon as I moved in, I basically had a year where I wasn't doing anything Jewish. All of a sudden, I was missing that Jewish element of my life because in myself, and not in my mind, but just in my whole self, community equated to Jewish community. And so I had a chance to go to a meeting and things of other Jews in the countercultural community. We ended up starting a chavurah and a Jewish collective, a radical Jewish collective, Chutzpah. And this was in the summer of 1971. And we covered all different issues in Chutzpah in our discussions. We had the first issue of our journal came out in 1972, anti-Semitism, feminism, racism, class issues, all kinds of issues that we were tackling. And I would say that really our watchword, our catchword, and certainly it was mine and continues to be, is im ein ani li mili. If I'm not for myself, who am I? But if I'm only for myself, what am I? And of course, im lo achshav eimatai. If not now, if we don't act now, it's not going to happen. When is it going to happen? So, and if there were egalitarian minions around, but about a year later, the rabbi who had been the assistant rabbi at the shul where I grew up, the congregation part broke off. He called me up and asked me to teach Hebrew school. I said, oh, well, okay, yeah, I could do that. It's a way to earn money. And so my aha moment really was when I started working in that congregation, I realized that there was work to do outside this bubble of a countercultural community. There was work to do in the mainstream Jewish community. And here it was, 11 years later. I mean, to me, it felt like generations later. There still were very few girls being given being taught Hebrew, becoming bat mitzvah. And I would say, so that was 1972. I would say 2 or 3 years later, it was equal numbers. All the girls and boys were having bar and bat mitzvahs. There was a whole generation of women who hadn't had a good Jewish education. Their brothers had. So I started teaching an adult bat mitzvah class so that they could learn Hebrew. They would understand the prayers. They would be able to come up for an aliyah. They would be able to read Torah. And at the same time, back in the city, fast forward to 1977, a bunch of us started we took a 6-flat, we'd lived in communes. The commune I lived in, that I moved into that had been radical Mennonite, a year later we turned it into a women's commune. So we purchased a 6-flat, 6 families, and we were living there together. And we basically, when our kids got old enough, we were teaching them around the dining room table. None of us belonged to a synagogue. There were egalitarian minions in the neighborhood. But I was still teaching and having an effect in this congregation in the suburbs near where I had grown up. And it included where, I don't know, you've probably been in, maybe you've been in a service where it's a bar bat mitzvah and they pass the Torah down from generation to generation. Well, back then, they passed the Torah down from grandfather to father to son, or grandfather to father to daughter. And I said something about it, so they started doing, okay, we'll do grandmother to mother to daughter. And then we had some more discussion, and it became, okay, you've got the passing the Torah between the grandparents, the parents, and whatever gender the child was. So that was like something to work out in that arena. But then in 1986, we moved to Woodstock, Illinois, 60 miles northwest of the city. And we joined a synagogue for the first time. And basically, there was the only thing Jewish happening in the whole county was a synagogue. So we joined the synagogue. And again, I had to take what I had been doing in my bubble into a world outside my bubble and work on having women having an equal role, because they would have a rabbi for a while, even though technically they counted women. And, you know, he would come in and say, oh, so who are we counting this morning? Because he was Orthodox. But I guess eventually down the line, I realized, I kept saying, I could do a better job than that. I could do a better job than that. But I was in charge of the school. But then I found out that I could actually go to rabbinical school, even though there was no place to go in Chicago. So I did end up becoming a rabbi. But I guess what I wanted to say is, in terms of my work, I feel has been bringing Judaism to feminists and bringing feminism to Jews. So that when we did go to the Socialist Feminist Conference in 75, we had a Jewish caucus. And so one aspect of that is, yes, dealing with anti-Semitism, but also dealing with the joy of Judaism. And when I was able to teach in the Liberation School of the Chicago Women's Liberation Union on women in the Bible, I would teach about Rebecca working around the patriarch to do what needed to be done, and work on Shifra and Pua. I just suggested to Trua that they have a new T-shirt that says, how does it go? Fighting tyranny? Resisting tyrants since Shifra and Pua is what I would like to see. So yeah, and playing catch up with women who didn't have a chance to learn about Judaism, and working on God language. I was pasting together prayer books that wouldn't refer to God as He. Now there's like such a wide variety of gender neutral Sidurim that it's really heartening. So recently, two things. I've been working with other feminists, and that is Sisters of Mercy, in terms of doing pastoral care for immigrants in detention. And that's been just such a blessing to work with nuns and other people, but these are the women who actually organized it. And last fall, there was an issue of Jewish Currents on chutzpah, and a young man in Chicago, he brought together people to hear from people in the Chutzpah Collective, and there were 150 20-somethings in that room to hear about chutzpah, who are now organizing from a Jewish perspective. So that was just so heartening to hear. So, thank you.
So in talking about the work that I've engaged in as a Jewish feminist, I want to emphasize that when I became a feminist, I was already a graduate student in theology. And after the first meeting of the Yale Women's Alliance, I went to a local coffee shop with Carol Christ, who was the other graduate student and female graduate student in theology at that time in my program. And we began discussing the implications of what we had just heard for our studies. And that was actually the beginning of our lifelong friendship and collaboration. At the time, I was a second-year student at Yale. Carol was a third-year student. And we had never read a single book or article by a woman. But we had actually never thought about that until that moment, because, we were in theology, theologians were men, who else were we going to be reading? But now, suddenly we began to ask ourselves, were there really no women in the history of theology? And if that was true, what did it mean for us personally that we were being trained to be theologians? And more importantly, what did it mean for the field? I mean, theology talks about very fundamental questions. Who's God? What is the world like? What does it mean to be a human being? How are these questions distorted by women's absence from the conversation? So very quickly, we began reading everything by women that we could get our hands on. Mary Daly had published The Church and the Second Sex at that point, which she later renounced. But it was still, at the moment, it was exciting. Rosemary Radford Ruther was writing. We found an article by Valerie Saving that had been written in 1960 and made a splash at the time and then completely vanished, in which Saving argued that the Christian doctrines of sin and grace were deeply misnamed because of the failure to include women's experience. And that article actually became the foundation of my dissertation. And then within a couple of years, Carol and I were both very involved in the creation of a program unit on women and religion in the American Academy of Religion. I was actually co-chair of the unit in the second and third years of its existence. And I remember very clearly in 1972, Mary Daly gave a paper that was the core of Beyond God the Father. And it was completely mind-blowing. I mean, the room was packed. People were sitting on tables, under tables. I can still picture the energy and excitement in the room. So from the very beginning of trying to find my voice as a Jewish feminist, I was very immersed in a group of Christian and post-Christian feminists who at that point were way ahead of where Jewish women were in thinking about the nature of religious patriarchy. The questions, could we remain within a patriarchal tradition? Did we need to leave? Were we talking about women having access to formerly male roles? Were we talking about wanting to completely transform our traditions? Those were all questions that were very much on the table. By the mid-'70s, my friend Carol had left Christianity to become a goddess feminist. She pushed me at the time, and she continued to push me in the book that we wrote together just a couple of years ago on how I could remain in a patriarchal tradition. So that was always a very real question for me. For quite a few years, Rita Gross and I were the only Jews in a cohort of women who were trying to change the discipline of religious studies. I was very aware of being a Jew. Everybody knew I was a Jew, although actually there were a couple of times that I appeared on lists of Protestant feminists because I'd done my dissertation on Tillich and Reinhold Niebuhr. But I was very much a part of the larger community of feminist scholars in religion. So I think it's important in talking about my work that I've always had a foot in two worlds, in the Feminist Academy and in an emerging Jewish feminist community. And all the questions that I've raised within Judaism, all the writing and the speaking that I did from the first Jewish feminist conference on was inseparable from my work in the academy. Alice Shalby once said to me, that she thought that Standing Again at Sinai could have been written only in the land of Mary Daly. I think that was a brilliant insight, and I would say yes, but not only in the land of Mary Daly, that I was part of the same extended conversation as Mary Daly.
So I'm going to skip forward a few years in my narrative of myself. During those early 1980s years, I joined New Jewish Agenda, and that was like my community of like-minded Jews who were doing the similar kinds of things that I was doing, being a progressive voice among Jews and a Jewish voice among progressives. And in 1990, I became the managing editor of the feminist journal Bridges, which, we published for 21 years and thought of ourselves as a radical Jewish feminist publication. But the story I want to tell is, I was an editor for those 21 years, and I'm finally, just in the last 3 months, an editor again of a Jewish publication, the Washtenaw County Jewish News, our local publication. And I'm kind of focused on the role, the effect, and the responsibility of Jewish publishing of Jewish writing on the community. So I'm going to tell a little story about that. This story is not about my friend Stefan, my beloved friend, who died from complications of AIDS in 1993, the year we both turned 38. Stefan and I had been friends for 30 years, since he chose me to be his girlfriend in 3rd grade, and thus bestowed self-consciousness on me. Someday I want to write stories about me and Stefan, but we had a complex relationship that, even though he passed away 26 years ago, I still have a complex relationship with him because I have recurring dreams about him in which he never leaves me and is always leaving me. But this story is not about Stefan. It's about the afternoon of his funeral in St. Louis County, which I spent among his relatives, his partner, and a few of our old friends from high school. He died in New York City. He'd had AIDS for many years. He tried to tell me many times, but I wouldn't listen. I was living in Seattle when the reality hit me, because he wrote me a card that said, "I have AIDS," and I finally accepted it. And I bought a ticket immediately from Seattle to New York to go visit him. And the ticket was a week from the day that I bought it, and he died 6 days later. So I had to divert the ticket to St. Louis to attend his funeral. My plane arrived just as the funeral was ending, so I gathered with others at his parents' house. It was the same home that he'd lived in since we were 8, and I lived down the street until we both left for college. This is a story about his shiva, but not even about his shiva. It's about his Jewish family and something that was revealed to me that afternoon that I've never forgotten. Stefan had not told his mother that he was sick. He loved her, and he loved all of his relatives as if they were characters in a play that he'd carved into his heart, desperately close, yet his own invention. He couldn't let himself imagine their grief. He'd never told his mother that he was gay, though he'd always known and had started having sex with men not long after his bar mitzvah. I knew everything about his life, pretty much. But there were, so many stories about him, but we had grown apart over the years by the time we were 38. With his death, I had lost a lifelong friend who had given shape to my life, but his mother had lost a son. At the Shiva, I could barely look her in the eye. He had asked to be cremated, and she had buried his body in a Jewish cemetery. But that's not what I want to talk about either. At his Shiva, there was a memorial book, a scrapbook of a collection of his accomplishments. He was a theater person, a director, sometimes actor. He'd studied theater in Poland and in Yugoslavia on 2 Fulbright scholarships. And he'd founded an acting ensemble in St. Louis, and then he went on to become the associate director of the National Theater Institute at the Eugene O'Neill Theater. The last 3 years of his life, he worked for Actors Equity, organizing events as a special assistant to the Equity president, Ron Silver. And his scrapbook was filled with his theatrical accomplishments. In high school, Stefan had introduced me to Yiddish theater in Poland and the United States. I don't remember how he made all the connections, but he grew to love experimental theater in Poland. And I can't say that I understood his artistic passions. But there he was in 1992, slowly dying, and Sarajevo was under siege. Months before, Susan Sontag staged Waiting for Godot in besieged Sarajevo in October 1993, which was 2 months after Stefan died. He helped produce an event in New York to raise funds for the children of Bosnia. The benefit featured the actors Corin and Vanessa Redgrave and others, and he had been very proud of this event. He was very committed to the cause. In the scrapbook, as it was passed around at his shiva, there was a flyer from the event. While not talking very much, various family members and I looked through the book, and one of Stefan's beloved aunts looked at the Bosnia benefit flyer, saw the name Redgrave, and I overheard her say, "Aren't we supposed to hate her?" That's the moment that I'm bringing inside me to my work in the Jewish community. I work I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to just remind myself of the question that I'm going to be answering, which is, what was the nature of the work, the Jewish feminist work that I engaged in, and does the adding Jewish to feminist frame capture your experience? And I guess I want to begin by saying that the frame doesn't capture my experience. I don't see parallels or commonality between Jewish feminism and feminism. For me, they came out of the same place. They're who I am. The work that I did in the women's health movement in New York came out of the same place as the work that I did and have continued to do as a Jewish feminist. The academic work that I have done as a feminist comes out of that same place, and it's about a sense of justice and democracy and freedom and all those good things. So for me, adding Jewish to feminist isn't the frame that I would use, but I can still talk some about what I was doing as a Jewish feminist, I guess over the past 50 years. So I want to just say a little bit more about some of the things I mentioned before in terms of those click moments, that everything that I did really has come out of communities and collectivity, and exactly the same thing that Heather was saying last night and everybody was saying in the panel before, that we see injustices and we talk about them, or we don't necessarily see them until we talk about them, but as we're talking about them, we recognize that something has to change, and we realize that the only way that something's going to change is by doing it. We were talking earlier this afternoon about fear, and I was realizing, at some point, at various points, people said to me, "Oh, what you did was very courageous." And I said, I wasn't courageous, I was scared the whole time. And somebody said to me, and I think this is really important, sort of back to the conversation we were having earlier, being courageous isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing it despite being afraid. And I think that's what the collectivity of women and the left and the progressive movements of which we have been a part has been all about. So I guess I'm going to just say two things in terms of the two major Jewish feminist things that I've been involved with in my life is one, Ezrat Nashim, which came out of that moment in the New York Chavurah, and, you know, kind of, I guess, birthed in some ways the movement for access, equal access in the Jewish community. And I want to say that even as we did that and started calling for women to be admitted to rabbinical schools and cantorial schools and be able to be full members of synagogues and be counted in minyanim and be treated as equals in the Jewish community, all those different things, we knew that wasn't enough, and we knew it wasn't what we wanted, but we didn't know what we wanted. I mean, we got as far as studying in this Chavurah class to realize that Judaism had been created by men for men, and that a Judaism that was going to treat women's experience equally would be very different. We had no idea what that would look like, and we were convinced by friends that we couldn't wait until we figured that out to go public. And so we started calling for equal access. And that's the route, I think, that Ezrat Nashim took, and which is still being played out and has led to tremendous changes in the Jewish community. And then I think the other experience came from the moment I was talking about, about allowing ourselves to ask questions of texts that nobody wanted to ask before, and helping to start this organization, Benot Esh, which has been maybe 50 women have been involved in this over the course of its 37-year history, but it's had a profound impact, much broader than that, on the Jewish community. And I think, sort of, what should Judaism look like, and what should be the relationship of the religious Jewish community toward the world around us? That, I think for a long time Jewish feminists were focused so much on changing the Jewish community that we some of us diverted our attentions away from the larger community outside. So I guess one of the things where I would like to end is that I think the work that we started many years ago is far from over. There are many, many questions, obviously. And for me, I think one of the questions I'd like to pose here, and we've started talking about it really already, is I think our feminist awareness came out of a sense of exclusion, right? There was a community that we felt not fully included in, and we insisted as feminists, as lesbians, as various different groups within the Jewish community that we wanted to be heard and attended to. And for many years, and still, I guess, when I've spoken in Jewish communities and elsewhere about these kinds of things, one of the big questions we get is, what about men? You're only talking about women, what about men? Why are you leaving us out? I never thought we were leaving men out. I thought men needed to figure out how to come along, how to engage in a Judaism in which they were not at the center. And I think that's a question now that many in mainstream Jewish communities and not so mainstream Jewish communities face, and communities on the left more generally. How do we engage in institutions in which some part of we, have been at the center and now realize that we need to move aside or de-center those who have been centered? Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, for example, an organization which I've been involved with in New York, talks about centering the leadership of Jews of color and Sephardi Mizrahi Jews. And then, of course, the same analogous question comes up. Well, what about Ashkenazi? What about us white Ashkenazi Jews? What's happening to us who've been at the center, for all the past? How do those of us who grew up as feminists challenging all gender roles respond to the centering of trans folk? Are we not important anymore? And I think those kinds of questions of how does the community really de-center those who have been at the center and try to understand in a new way who we are and how we organize ourselves, which we started talking about in the last session, is where we need to go.
So I'll happily open the room for questions. We have a microphone. They're already on, so you don't need to.
Oh, okay. Someone turn off your Amber Alert. No, I'm thrilled with this panel, but I just wanted to add two things. Whoever quoted Rabbi Hillel, I'm always reminded, and I think we've been mentioning the names of people who would be here, and one is Adrienne Rich, and she always quoted the Hillel saying with the last words, and if not with others, how? And if someone could translate that into Hebrew, that would be really nice, because we can only say it in English. And of course, there would be Marcia Falk, who created a liturgy that's ungendered, which was extremely radical. And so I wanted to also say that Adrienne, when we started De Wilde Chayes, which you've read about if you looked at Joyce's book, I remember saying, oh, this is terrifying. Even after Nice Jewish Girls was out, it was still terrifying to be in a group that was that explicitly political and Jewish. And I remember she said, if you're not afraid, then the work really isn't radical edge. So, and that has always stayed with me too. And then the last thing, I know you both said something about Banat Esh, which was, I was a part of it too, and many others were for a time. But to say something a little more specific about what we did, because it's quite an amazing thing, and I think that's a few details maybe. I remember there was some talk, Jane talked some about goddesses and Jewishness, and that felt terrifying at that time. And so say a little bit about what you've done. I think that I'd like people to hear about it.
So Banat Esh began with the very modest goal of transforming Judaism over a weekend. We sent out a letter to a group of women who were interested, who were whom we knew, who were Jewishly knowledgeable, feministly knowledgeable, and interested in spirituality, inviting them to come and think about what it would mean to rethink Judaism with women's experience at the center. And I think one of the things that was really important is that everybody who came felt like a feminist among the Jews and a Jew among feminists, and was expecting a sense of home and safety, that at last we had a community where everyone was going to be like us and where we shared a set of common goals. And what we found was that we were deeply different from each other, that we actually usually we start on Thursday, but that year we started on a Friday. And Friday night, there were some women who were incredibly excited about praying together with other women from the prayer book, and others of us felt like we didn't organize this retreat and come from all over the place in order to do a traditional davening, not on my life. And we ended up spending Shabbat morning sitting in the hall crying because we couldn't agree on what we wanted to do. And that really, we didn't meet. That was 1980. We didn't meet in 81. It was 81. We didn't meet in 82 because it was, so painful. But in 83, we met again and have been meeting ever since. And one of the things we've tried to do is to make our differences the basis for discussion. So our religious differences, our class differences, our different feelings about where we were located racially, gender issues, many issues. So actually, I'll let Martha fill in, but that has really been important. But the fundamental question has been, what would a Judaism look like that placed women's experience at the center in all these different dimensions?
Yeah, I would just add one thing to that, and that is, Judith said we made our differences the focus of things, and one of the ways in which we did that, well, there are two ways in which we did that. We realized that we could not operate on a common denominator model, that if we did that, we would move nowhere. So whoever was the organizing committee changed each year, and responsibility for different sessions changed each year as well. Whoever was leading had the full authority of the group to do whatever they wanted, more or less, and that we would go with that no matter what. And if we were uncomfortable and felt like we just couldn't stay in the room, you could leave, but we would not prevent it from happening. And I think that was really very, very important. We spent a lot of time being very uncomfortable, some more than others, but those discomforts made it possible for us to push ourselves past. And I think another thing that was very important, and this, because spirituality and religious expression is and was a very important part of the group, oftentimes it was in and through davening that we addressed some of the most difficult questions. We have really tried to make our lives into Torah, so oftentimes we'll have writing workshops and then we'll read it as sacred text on Shabbat morning. Sometimes we've had our elders in particular tell their stories, and we've had that as Torah, and we've said brachot before and after. And that kind of ritualizing things has been very powerful. And I'll stop there.
Hi, Tilly Shamus from Michigan Hillel. Martha, I'm really struck by your closing, and I'm thinking about loss and loss of power, and thinking in particular men as allies and the emotional labor on women to help men deal with the loss of power that they experience as women advance and can be successful as feminists. And I'm thinking also of Jewish women of color and the place for white women in being, who I believe are being called in, but not to be at the center. And I feel that. And so I'm thinking in that framework of what's my responsibility as a white Jewish feminist in turning to other white Jewish feminists as an ally to Jewish women of color, and what can be learned in that to be teaching men about the loss that they experience. And I would just love your advice on that and how to do that without feeling the exhaustion of the emotional labor of it.
I mean, I raised the question because you know, this is something, and I think particularly it's come up in B'not Eish, it's come up elsewhere, it's come up, of course, in the aftermath of all, or in the context and in the aftermath of all the discussions around the Women's March. I mean, I think those of us who are used to being somehow at the center need to learn to deal with what those feelings are. And it was kind of just this weekend, actually, when we were talking about it with a friend, that I was kind of realizing the extent of the analogy, that you know, guys have been dealing with this or not dealing with it for a long time, and I had no patience for them. And I understand that people have no, you know, a lot of Jewish women of color, Jews of color, have no patience for me. You know, we've got to learn, we've got to figure this out. I think acknowledging it, talking about it, you know, beginning, and maybe, you know, the more we can see the connections, the better. I think it's somehow also connected to what I was saying before about Eric Ward's talking about anti-Semitism. That if we don't talk about anti-Semitism, who's going to, and who's going to learn about it? And there's something about decentering ourselves or acknowledging how uncomfortable that is. But that's as far as I can go with it. It's in very early stages of articulation.
Thank you so much. I think something has come up in this panel that we haven't really explored here at the conference, and I'm not quite sure how to articulate it. But Judith, when you were talking about sort of your scholarly work, and the inroads that made, it was very important. I can tell you, as the director of both the Jewish Studies program and a Women's Studies program, how I had to find a jury of her peers for the women who were coming up for tenure. I had to look hard to find that and to argue that you can't judge this woman's work by a patriarchal long tradition. I had to find a Judith Plaskow and a Carol Christ. In other words, it wasn't just the Jewish part of it. It was that there had to be that transformation of knowledge. And that's where I think something new has come out here, and that is that we've been talking about activism in the community, activism as a collective. But we haven't, I think, made it clear that you have to have the activism in the academy as well. And it's also based on a collective. I mean, women's studies was the political base for our transformation of knowledge, and how important that transformation is on everyday activity. To organize around Judaism, to change what we want to change, we have to have the research that's there that says, look, this is not new. Or look, when we bring in women's experiences, what does that mean? How does that fit into all the rest of this ritual? So I thank you for bringing this into the conversation. I didn't mean to take it away from the other important issues that have come up.
There's something, Susan Weidman-Schneider, there's something else that came up that I don't think has come up before, and Evie Beck, who wants us to do some spiritual dancing, I think, before the afternoon is over, might bring more of this in. But just as you were talking, Judith and Martha, about B'not Eish, I remember thinking that I had gotten that letter in, 1980 or 1981, thinking, I'm not spiritual enough for this. But just thinking about how we sort of have evolved into recognizing what there is in Jewish life. Maybe you were the one, Judith, who said a long time ago about the elasticity in the tradition, but that it's not adding Judaism into feminism, but it is really in that sort of praxis about what is Torah. You know, here a woman is telling her story. You say a bracha before and after she tells her story. It is that these aren't new narratives. And I have to say, with a lot of gratitude, that until I heard you said that, and that this is, you know, in the interest of full disclosure, though Lilith has published for a long time on what is a kind of women's holiness? What does a woman carry in her tallis bag? You know, what is a different kind of holiness? It was just in that very lovely articulation, Martha, about, oh, you say a bracha before and after, just as someone said, maybe it was Rabbi Sandy Sasso, we will know that the Judaism and feminism has been integrated when a book of women's stories falls and you pick it up and kiss it. So this is just with a lot of gratitude. Thank you.
Hi, thanks all of you for this really amazing conversation. I'm Judith Rosenbaum from the Jewish Women's Archive. My question is sort of maybe a complementary question to Tilly's, which is that a lot of what or at least some of the projects that you've all talked about were women-only projects. And so I'm curious about the place of segregated space in feminism today. I mean, obviously, it's more complicated now that we don't see gender as a binary. But how do we think about that in terms of both these questions of centering, in terms of these questions of allyship? What's the value? How should we be, you know, what's the place of this now? Because obviously there was so much richness that came out of this. And I wonder if this also relates in some ways to some of the tensions we talked about earlier around racial divides and the end of the beloved community in favor of Black power, and how that disrupted some things in very positive and powerful ways, and some things in ways that maybe we're still trying to put back together.
I think that there's a way in which, as the Jewish community has as women have had access to a range of roles, at least in the non-Orthodox community, it almost feels like reneging on a bargain to have women's space. It becomes more and more difficult to justify, and I think there's more of a sense of injury sometimes on the part, you know, that men will say, we're not allowed to have men's space. You know, how come you're allowed to have women's space? And yet there are so many things going on in the community. I mean, the issue of Me Too in the Jewish community being one, but the ways in which rabbis who are women still feel like they're not operating on a level playing field, and I've heard this from so many women. So there are so many issues like that speak to the continued need for segregated spaces, and segregated in a broader way, like B'nai Ish has trans members now. So I think that all, you know, formally women's only groups are grappling with the challenges to the gender binary, but still the need for spaces to talk about what is going on. Why have the structures of male dominance proved so much more intransigent than we had believed they were, you know, 50 years ago when we thought that we could change the world. So I think there's still definitely a need for segregated spaces. At the same time, it's more complicated.
I see two examples of the value of Jewish women's space. One of them is on Facebook. There's a Jewish women's clergy page on Facebook. I don't know if other Jewish clergy here, you know, I've seen people. And some of it is just sharing resources that could be male or female, but some of it is bringing up issues that have to do specifically with how a female rabbi or cantor is being treated in their congregation. It could have to do with comments on their appearance or the name that's used, their first name being used, but how you deal with maternity leave, or the lack thereof. But I think also in terms of creatively dealing with midrash, with ritual, with liturgy, I think these are areas where it's still valuable for women to meet with other women to develop ritual and to develop midrash, which is not to say that shouldn't be happening, with men as well. But I still think that there's a space for it to be segregated.
I don't know if this is actually adding to it or not, but I think we're at a place where we need both and. I don't think, I'm not ready to say there's no longer any need for segregated spaces of a variety of different kinds. It's not gender only, I think. So, I mean, I think there is a need for separate spaces, and at the same time, there's a need for people to be able to get together not in separate spaces. And, you know, I think trying to find that balance and figure out how to do it, it's another one of the big, you know, questions for the day. I mean, it's a really important question, but I think trying to hold both of those things at the same time is very important. Obviously, we need, whoever the we is, we need each other going forward. And given power dynamics in the society and in our communities, we also may need separate spaces for people to have temporary safety. I mean, one of my favorite all-time articles is Bernice Johnson Reagan's Coalition Politics, and you know, we can't live in those barred rooms, but we also, you know, we need them. So we need both.
Hey, I'm Marla, Brett Schneider. Thank you so much for this panel. As everything so far, it's been so wonderful, and I want to say ditto to so much. And I do, on the segregated thing, I don't even want to use the word segregated because in the United States that has a problematic history, but I want to reclaim. So I really do still think that being together with people you choose in the context of structural inequality remains imperative. And also our many years of learning how we recreate exclusions is imperative. So just different language from Martha to say it's not easy to figure out and you got to do a bunch of things at a bunch of times. Know you're going to make mistakes, but then keep being humble enough to keep walking. And similarly, I've been involved in numerous communities where this concept of can you decenter, and I don't even want to use center and periphery in my work anymore. I've already written and tried to abandon that, and even though it was so important for me for decades, right? But the ways in which sometimes, you know, when that's worked better and when it hasn't worked, and even when there may be so many more of the somebodies, but that hasn't changed the paradigm, right? So the National Kavra community, feminists transformed it, and eventually lesbians and a little bit of trans, and at the same time, what you said to me 30 years ago is like, if you don't do the feminist thing explicitly, it's not going to happen, and 30 years later, it's still a community that's a million times perhaps better than in many other communities, but it's like unbelievable how that can still happen. So I just want to share, and I'm looking around for who's here and might have been on this journey with me. So one of the places that I've seen that, at least in my personal experience, because other people are really pissed off, but the Jewish Multiracial Network. So I've been involved in the Jewish Multiracial Network for about 20 years. The folks who started it were about 10 years ahead of me, and they were mostly white parents who had the people who founded it. And they all good intentions, all good stuff, mostly white parents who had adopted kids of color. And at a certain point and that was good and bad, and it was a messed up, volunteer, disorganized organization, and it was fantastic, and it's been incredibly important to me and to my political work and my family. At a certain point, some of us made a conscious decision to reorganize the leadership, where people of color in the organization, adults of color in the organization, took leadership, and we still are railing about that. Like, there are still occasionally white members who somehow, this happened, seriously, I don't know, 15 years ago, and occasionally there was literally 2 weeks ago a thing like, when did this happen? I was an early founder. Where are the white people? But, okay, so it's not that it's smooth or fine, but I will, and it required significant reorientations to the lefty, more secular white parents when we shifted the demographics and shifted the leadership. A lot had to change, and that is also upsetting to some people and great for some people. Anyway, so I just want to share, I've been part of a lot of communities who've tried it in different ways and have seen a range of things that sort of work better and work worse, and a lot of these things a lot of you know and have taught me, the combinations of stepping up and stepping back and doing both at the same time and finding your place and like going off a board but not stopping the work, right? So if you need to step down from a position on the board, you still should put in all those same hours that you used to put in, so there's just, anyway, so I just want to share, I have seen a real array, and JMN, at least in my experience, has been a Jewish Multiracial Network, has been one of the more successful that have changed its internal paradigms, as hard as it still is.
We have time for just one more question in the corner.
Thanks. My name is Shoshana. I'm a transgender woman and I'm Jewish. And I just wanted to say that I actually do also appreciate gender separated spaces, like being in, so I've been going to U of M Hillel sometimes for Friday night, Kabbalat Shabbat, and especially they have a partnership minyan, and where women lead some of it and men lead some of it, and being in a mechitzed space for me is actually very affirming. So even as a trans woman, I actually find that really nice. Okay, that's it.
Thank you so much. Thanks to our panelists for sharing your experiences. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.